The fluorescent lights in the Riverside County Sheriff's Department flickered with their usual mechanical stutter as Detective Maria Santos placed the worn manila folder on the table between them. Sophia Anderson watched the dust motes dance in the afternoon light streaming through the barred windows, her hands folded neatly in her lap, fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles had gone white. She wore a cream-colored cardigan over a floral dress, the kind of outfit her students at Lincoln Elementary always said made her look like their favorite grandmother, though she was only 53. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. Ms. Anderson, Detective Santos began, her voice carrying that practiced gentleness that police officers use when they're about to destroy someone's world. We need to talk about the summer of 2007. Sophia's eyes remained fixed on the folder. She could see her own name written in faded blue ink across the tab, and below it, another name that made her chest constrict. Daniel Chen, missing persons. 18 years. It had been 18 years since that name had meant anything to anyone outside of a filing cabinet in this very building. The detective's partner, a younger man with tired eyes named Officer James Reeves, leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He'd been watching Sophia since they'd brought her in for routine questioning 3 hours ago. She hadn't asked for a lawyer. She hadn't demanded to know why she was here. She'd simply gathered her purse, left her third-grade classroom in the capable hands of the substitute teacher, and followed them to the car with the quiet resignation of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for nearly 2 decades. "Do you remember Daniel Chen?" Santos asked, pulling out a photograph from the folder. The image showed a young man, maybe 23 or 24, with kind eyes and a smile that suggested he laughed easily. He wore a UCLA sweatshirt and stood in front of a cherry blossom tree in full bloom. "Of course I remember him," Sophia said softly, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd spent 30 years teaching children to read. "Everyone in Riverside remembers Daniel Chen." It was true. In the summer of 2007, when Daniel Chen vanished from the parking lot of the Riverside Community Center where he'd been volunteering as a youth counselor, the entire city had mobilized. Search parties had combed the nearby hills. His face had been plastered on every telephone pole, every storefront window, every evening news broadcast. His parents, Grace and William Chen, had stood before cameras with trembling voices, begging for information, offering rewards they couldn't afford, clinging to hope like it was the only thing keeping them breathing. And then, as cases like this often do, it had gone cold. The leads dried up. The news cycles moved on. The missing persons posters faded in the California sun until they were just ghosts of ink on weathered paper. Grace Chen had died of a stroke in 2019, never knowing what happened to her son. William Chen still lived in the same house on Magnolia Avenue, now 78 years old, still keeping Daniel's room exactly as he'd left it. "We found him," Detective Santos said quietly, and Sophia closed her eyes. 3 weeks ago, construction workers breaking ground for a new housing development in Box Springs Mountain found remains. The DNA came back yesterday. "It's Daniel." The room fell silent except for the hum of the ancient air conditioning unit struggling against the October heat. Sophia could feel her heartbeat in her throat, could taste copper on her tongue. She'd imagined this moment so many times over the years that it had become abstract, theoretical, something that existed in the realm of nightmares rather than reality. "Ms. Anderson," Santos continued, her voice taking on a harder edge, "we need to know about your relationship with Daniel Chen. We need to know why his DNA was found on items buried with him that belong to you. We need to know why witnesses have come forward, after all these years, saying they saw you with him the night he disappeared." Sophia opened her eyes and looked directly at the detective for the first time. Her face was composed, almost serene, but her eyes held something ancient and unreadable. "You think I killed him, did you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the sounds of the city continued. Traffic on the interstate, someone's car alarm, the distant wail of a siren. Life moved forward, indifferent and relentless, while inside this small interrogation room, the past was finally catching up. "No," Sophia said, and her voice broke on the word, cracking open to reveal something raw and wounded beneath. No, I didn't kill Daniel Chen, but I know who did, and I've been protecting them for 18 years. Officer Reeves straightened from his position against the wall. Detective Santos leaned forward, her entire posture changing. This wasn't the response they'd expected. In their experience, people either denied everything or confessed. They didn't offer information about someone else. They didn't carry secrets for nearly 2 decades. Who? Santos demanded. Who are you protecting? Sophia's hands finally separated, reaching for the small silver locket she always wore around her neck. It was delicate, antique, the kind of thing passed down through generations. She'd worn it every day for 33 years, since her wedding day. Her students used to ask about it, and she'd tell them it contained a picture of someone very special. She'd never showed them what was inside. My husband, Sophia whispered, her fingers trembling as they touched the locket. Thomas Anderson. He killed Daniel Chen, and I helped him hide the body. The confession fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would eventually reach every corner of Riverside, every life that had been touched by Daniel Chen's disappearance. Every person who'd spent 18 years wondering what happened to the young man with the kind eyes who'd wanted nothing more than to make the world a little better. Detective Santos hit the record button on the camera mounted in the corner of the room. Ms. Anderson, I need to inform you of your rights. You have the right to remain silent. I know my rights, Sophia interrupted gently. I've known them for 18 years. Every day, I've woken up knowing exactly what I was. An accomplice to murder, a liar, a woman who let Daniel's parents die without answers. I know what I am. I've always known. She paused, her fingers still resting on the locket, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. But before you arrest me, before you take me away and put me in a cell where I belong, I need to tell you the whole story. Not the one you think you know. Not the one that makes sense from the outside. The real story. The one about how a good person can do a terrible thing. How love can twist into something monstrous. How silence can become a prison you build one day at a time until you don't even remember what freedom looked like. Detective Santos exchanged a glance with Officer Reeves. They'd been doing this job long enough to know that when someone wanted to talk, really talk, you let them. Because the truth, when it finally came out, was often stranger and more complicated than any theory they could construct. All right, Santos said, settling back in her chair. Tell us. Start from the beginning. Tell us everything. Sophia nodded slowly, her eyes drifting to the window where the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, in the house she'd shared with Thomas for 33 years, were the remnants of their life together. The garden she'd tended, the bookshelves lined with teaching manuals and novels, the kitchen where they'd cooked dinner side by side for decades. Somewhere out there was the man she'd loved more than her own life, the man whose secret she'd carried like a stone in her chest until it had calcified into something permanent, something that had become as much a part of her as her own bones. It started in 2007, she began, her voice steadier now. But to really understand it, you need to know about 1992. That's when everything actually began. That's when I first met Thomas. And when I first learned what it meant to love someone so much that you'd burn down the world to keep them safe. Sophia Anderson had never imagined herself as someone capable of extraordinary things. Neither extraordinary good nor extraordinary evil. She'd grown up in Sacramento, the middle child of 3 daughters born to a postal worker father and a nurse mother. Her life had been painted in comfortable, predictable strokes. Decent grades, a few close friends, a scholarship to UC Riverside where she'd studied elementary education with the earnest determination of someone who genuinely believed she could change young lives one spelling test at a time. She met Thomas Anderson in the spring of 1992 at a community fundraiser for the new children's wing at Riverside Community Hospital. He was 32, 8 years her senior, working as a high school biology teacher at Martin Luther King High School. She was 24, fresh out of her credential program, still glowing with that particular idealism that hasn't yet been weathered by years in the trenches of public education. Thomas had been manning the donation table when she approached, fumbling with her checkbook, and he'd made a joke about how people their age didn't even know how to write checks anymore. She'd laughed, correcting him. She was much younger than him, she'd pointed out with mock indignation, and she wrote checks all the time, "Thank you very much." He'd smiled, really smiled, and something in that moment had clicked into place like a key in a lock she hadn't known was waiting to be opened. Their courtship had been gentle, almost old-fashioned. Coffee dates that turned into long walks along the Santa Ana River. Dinners at modest restaurants where they'd talk about their students, about the peculiar challenges of teaching in underfunded schools, about their shared belief that education was the truest form of hope. Thomas read poetry, Neruda, Whitman, Mary Oliver, and would sometimes recite lines to her as they watched the sunset from the Mission Inn's front steps. Sophia had been enchanted, completely and utterly, by this soft-spoken man who cried at wedding scenes in movies and who remembered the names of all his students' siblings. They married in 1992, a small ceremony in the garden of the Mission Inn with 20 guests and a jazz quartet that played "What a Wonderful World" as Sophia walked down the makeshift aisle. She wore her grandmother's locket for the first time that day, the one she'd been given when she turned 21. Inside, she'd placed a photo of Thomas, and she'd never taken it off since. The early years of their marriage had been lovely in their simplicity. They bought a modest house in the Canyon Crest neighborhood, a 3-bedroom bungalow with a backyard big enough for the vegetable garden Thomas immediately started planning. They'd both taught at schools within a few miles of each other, and they'd developed routines that felt like small rituals of devotion. Saturday morning farmers market trips, Sunday afternoon grading sessions where they'd sit on opposite ends of the couch with their papers spread around them, Thursday night cooking experiments where they'd try to recreate recipes from the international cookbook Thomas had bought on a whim. Sophia had been happy, not the fireworks kind of happy that movies promised, but the deeper, quieter kind that came from knowing you'd found your person, your home, your place in the world. She'd also been desperate to become a mother. They'd started trying in 1994, with the casual confidence of young couples who assumed biology would cooperate with their plans. When nothing happened after a year, they went to doctors. Tests revealed that Sophia had endometriosis, severe enough that natural conception would be difficult. IVF became their next hope, their next investment, their next heartbreak. 3 rounds, each one ending in failure, each one costing them money they didn't have and emotional reserves that were running dangerously low. Sophia could still remember sitting in the bathroom of their home in 1998, staring at another negative pregnancy test, feeling something inside her crack and splinter. She'd cried for 3 hours, great heaving sobs that made her ribs ache, and Thomas had held her the entire time, whispering promises she knew he couldn't keep, that it would be okay, that they had each other, that a child wasn't the only way to build a meaningful life. But she'd seen something shift in Thomas after that. A heaviness had settled over him like a coat he couldn't quite shrug off. He still smiled, still made jokes, still kissed her goodbye every morning before they left for work. But there was a distance now, a place inside him where she couldn't reach. He began staying late at school, volunteering for extra committees, taking on additional responsibilities. When she'd ask him about it, he'd say he just wanted to make a difference, wanted to feel useful, wanted to contribute something lasting to the world since they couldn't create their own legacy. She tried to understand, tried to be patient, tried to fill the space between them with the same love and devotion she'd always felt. But by 2007, 15 years into their marriage, Sophia had begun to feel like she was living with a ghost of the man she'd married. Someone who looked like Thomas, sounded like Thomas, but whose soul had retreated somewhere she couldn't follow. That summer, Sophia had taken a part-time position teaching remedial reading at the Riverside Community Center, a program funded by a grant meant to help struggling elementary students catch up before the fall semester. It was there that she'd met Daniel Chen. Daniel had been volunteering as a youth counselor in the adjacent program, working with at-risk teenagers. He was everything the world needed more of: patient, enthusiastic, genuinely interested in the kids he worked with. He'd recently graduated from UCLA with a degree in social work and had turned down higher-paying positions to come back to his hometown and give back to the community that had raised him. Sophia had liked him immediately. He'd reminded her of a young Thomas, of the man she'd fallen in love with before the weight of their shared disappointments had changed him. Daniel would pop into her classroom sometimes, bringing coffee he'd grabbed from the donation station, asking about her students, sharing stories about the teenagers he was mentoring. They'd struck up an easy friendship, the kind that felt natural and uncomplicated, built on shared values and mutual respect. What Sophia hadn't realized was that Thomas had noticed Daniel too. Her husband had started asking questions, casual ones at first, slipped into dinner conversation like they meant nothing. "Who's this Daniel guy you keep mentioning? How old is he? Is he always hanging around your classroom?" The questions had made Sophia uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite name, like detecting a strange smell in your house but not being able to identify the source. One evening in late June, Thomas had picked her up from the community center. Daniel had been walking Sophia to her car, carrying a box of books she was borrowing for her students. Thomas had watched them through the windshield, his face unreadable, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. "He's very friendly with you," Thomas had said on the drive home, his voice carefully neutral. "He's friendly with everyone," Sophia had replied, confused by the tone of the conversation. "He's a nice kid. Reminds me of you when you were younger, actually. That same energy, that belief that you can make a real difference." Thomas had gone silent for the rest of the drive. Looking back, Sophia would wonder how she'd missed the signs. The way Thomas had started accidentally, showing up at the community center when Sophia's shift was ending. The questions about Daniel that became more frequent, more pointed. The darkness that had crept into Thomas's eyes whenever Daniel's name came up in conversation. But at the time, she'd been so focused on her students, on the small victories of getting struggling readers to finally sound out a word they'd been stuck on maintaining the cheerful facade that had become her default mode of existence, that she'd failed to see the storm gathering in her own home. By July 2007, the summer reading program was in full swing. The community center buzzed with activity every weekday, children's laughter, the squeak of sneakers on the gymnasium floor, the hum of the air conditioning fighting against the relentless heat. Sophia had developed a routine. Arrive at 8, teach until noon, spend an hour having lunch in the break room where she'd grade papers or prepare lessons, then head home by 1:30. Daniel often ate lunch at the same time, and they'd fallen into the habit of sitting together, sharing the break room's wobbly table while they traded stories about their students or debated teaching philosophies. He told her about his parents, about how his father had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1970s with nothing but a suitcase and a dream, about how his mother had worked 2 jobs to put him and his sister through college. He talked about wanting to open his own community center someday, a place specifically for immigrant families and at-risk youth, a safe haven where kids could be themselves without judgment. "You're going to do amazing things," Sophia had told him one day in mid-July, and she'd meant it with her whole heart. "The world needs more people like you, Daniel. Never lose that spark." He'd grinned, that open, honest smile that made him look even younger than his 23 years. "You're one to talk, Ms. Anderson. My sister still talks about having you as her 3rd-grade teacher. She says you're the reason she learned to love reading. That's a kind of magic, you know, giving someone the gift of books." The memory made Sophia's throat tight. She'd been so proud in that moment, so validated in her life's work. She'd gone home that evening and told Thomas about the conversation, hoping to share her joy, hoping to remind him of why they'd chosen this profession in the first place. Thomas had barely looked up from his laptop. "Sounds like you two are getting pretty close," he'd said, his voice flat, and Sophia had felt a chill run down her spine despite the July heat. "Thomas, what's wrong?" she'd asked, sitting down across from him at the kitchen table. "Talk to me. You've been distant for weeks. Is it the school? Is it us? What's going on?" He'd finally looked at her then, and what she'd seen in his eyes had frightened her. Not anger. Anger she could have understood, could have addressed. This was something colder, more calculated, like looking into a mirror and seeing a stranger's reflection. "I think Daniel Chen has feelings for you," Thomas had said, and the statement was so absurd, so completely disconnected from reality, that Sophia had actually laughed. "That's ridiculous. He's 23 years old. He probably still has his UCLA parking permit on his dashboard. He's a kid, Thomas. A sweet kid who respects his elders and likes talking about education. That's all. I've seen the way he looks at you." He doesn't look at me any way except professionally. We're colleagues. We share a passion for teaching. That's it. But Thomas had shaken his head, closing his laptop with a soft click that had sounded, in retrospect, like a cell door locking. You don't see it because you're too trusting. You never see when people want things from you. But I do. I see everything. That conversation had ended with Thomas leaving for a walk, something he did now when discussions got uncomfortable. Just walked out the door without another word, sometimes not coming back for hours. Sophia had sat at the kitchen table, staring at her own reflection in the darkened window, wondering when her marriage had become something she didn't recognize. The night of July 23, 2007, Sophia had stayed late at the community center to organize supplies for the final week of the summer program. Daniel had offered to help, and they'd spent 2 hours sorting books and art supplies, laughing at the ridiculous motivational posters on the walls, talking about the books that had changed their lives. When they'd finished, it was nearly 8 o'clock, and the parking lot was dark except for the sodium lights that cast everything in an orange glow. Want me to walk you to your car? Daniel had offered, and Sophia had accepted, grateful for the company across the dimly lit parking lot. They'd been halfway to her Honda Civic when Thomas had appeared from the shadows near the dumpsters. Sophia could still remember every detail of that moment with painful clarity. The way Thomas's face had been twisted into something unrecognizable. The way Daniel had stepped protectively in front of her when Thomas approached. The way her husband had been holding something in his right hand, something that caught the light from the street lamps. "Thomas, what are you doing here?" she'd asked, her voice high and frightened. "I knew it," Thomas had said, and his voice had been strange, slurred almost, like he'd been drinking though Sophia hadn't smelled any alcohol. "I knew you were with him. I knew you were planning to leave me." "What? No. Thomas, we were just organizing supplies. This is insane. We need to go home and talk." But Thomas hadn't been listening. His eyes were fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made Sophia's blood run cold. "You think you can take her from me? You think you can just walk into our lives and destroy everything we've built?" Daniel had raised his hands in a placating gesture, his voice calm despite the obvious fear in his eyes. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Ms. Anderson and I are just co-workers. There's nothing." Thomas had moved so fast that Sophia barely registered what was happening. One moment he'd been standing there, and the next he'd lunged at Daniel with the object in his hand. A knife, she'd realized with dawning horror, a knife from their kitchen. Daniel had tried to dodge, but Thomas had caught him in the side, and Daniel had gone down with a cry of pain and shock. What happened next existed in Sophia's memory as a series of disconnected images, like photographs scattered across a table. Thomas standing over Daniel's fallen body. The spreading darkness on Daniel's UCLA sweatshirt. Sophia screaming, running forward, trying to pull Thomas away. The look on her husband's face when he turned to her. Not rage, not triumph, but confusion. As if he'd woken from a dream and didn't understand where he was or what he'd done. "Sophia," Thomas had whispered, dropping the knife. "Oh God. Sophia, what did I do?" Daniel Chen had still been breathing when Sophia dropped to her knees beside him. His eyes were wide with shock, his hands pressing against the wound in his side, blood seeping between his fingers and pooling on the asphalt of the parking lot. The sodium lights cast everything in that terrible orange glow, making the scene feel surreal, like something happening on a stage rather than in real life. "Call 911, Daniel had gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please." Sophia had already been reaching for her phone when Thomas grabbed her wrist. The touch was gentle but firm, and when she looked up at her husband, she saw something in his face that she'd never seen before. A desperate, pleading terror that made him look like a child caught in an unforgivable act. "We can't," Thomas said, and his voice was shaking. "Sophia, we can't. Do you understand what this means? My career, your career, our entire lives. We'll lose everything. He's dying." Sophia had screamed, trying to wrench her arm free. "Thomas, let go. We have to help him." But Thomas had held on. And in that moment, Sophia had watched the man she'd loved for 15 years transform into someone she didn't know. His eyes had gone cold, calculating, the panic being replaced by something harder, more determined. He'd looked at Daniel, then back at Sophia, and spoken words that would echo in her nightmares for the next 18 years. If we call for help, I go to prison. You know that. You know what happens to teachers in prison, Sophia. I won't survive it. Is that what you want? Is this kid worth destroying both of our lives? Daniel had been trying to speak, trying to call for help himself, but his voice was getting weaker. Blood continued to spread across the pavement, and Sophia had felt reality splitting into two paths. One where she called 911, where she chose to save Daniel's life and damn her husband, and one where she stayed silent, where she chose Thomas and became complicit in something unforgivable. She'd hesitated. God help her. She'd hesitated for 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours, torn between the man dying at her feet and the man she'd promised to love through better or worse. And in that hesitation, Daniel's eyes had started to lose focus. "Thomas," she'd whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We can't do this. We can't just let him die. This isn't who we are." But Thomas had already pulled out his own phone, his fingers shaking as he typed something. "It's too late anyway," he'd said, his voice hollow. "He's going into shock. Even if we called now, he wouldn't make it. We're past the point of saving him, Sophia. All we can do now is save ourselves." Sophia had looked down at Daniel, at his glazing eyes, at the way his chest was moving in shallow, irregular gasps. Something in her had broken in that moment, something that would never fully heal. She'd reached out and taken Daniel's hand, squeezing it gently, and whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Daniel's lips had moved, forming words she could barely hear. It might have been help, or why, or maybe just a breath that sounded like language. Then his eyes had gone still, fixed on something beyond her, and the terrible gurgling sound from his chest had stopped. Thomas had checked for a pulse with shaking hands, then looked at his wife with eyes full of horror and determination. "We need to move him, now, before someone sees." The next hours had existed in a fog of unreality for Sophia. She'd functioned on autopilot while Thomas made decisions, gave instructions, transformed from panicked killer to coldly efficient criminal. They'd used blankets from Thomas's car trunk to wrap Daniel's body. They'd driven to Box Springs Mountain, a place they'd hiked together years ago, back when they were still happy, and they'd buried him in a shallow grave far from any trail, marking the location only in their memories. Thomas had been methodical, almost compulsive in his planning. He'd taken Daniel's wallet, his keys, his phone, anything that could identify him. He'd disposed of their bloodied clothes in different dumpsters across the city. He'd cleaned the parking lot with bleach he'd apparently been carrying in his trunk, evidence that he'd been planning something, though Sophia hadn't wanted to acknowledge what that meant about premeditation. They'd arrived home as dawn was breaking, both of them silent, both of them stained with dirt and trauma. Thomas had gone immediately to the shower, and Sophia had stood in their kitchen. The kitchen where they'd cooked thousands of meals together, where they'd laughed and planned and dreamed, and she'd understood that her life as she'd known it was over. The days after Daniel's disappearance had been their own special kind of hell. Sophia had watched the news coverage, had seen Grace Chen's tearful pleas, had participated in the search parties because not participating would have been suspicious. She'd stood in the community center's gymnasium with hundreds of other volunteers, looking at maps while knowing exactly where Daniel was, feeling bile rise in her throat every time someone speculated about what might have happened to him. Thomas had been calm throughout all of it, eerily so. He'd given a statement to police about being home all evening on July 23rd, and Sophia had corroborated his alibi because by then she was in too deep, too complicit, too committed to the lie. He'd attended the vigils held for Daniel, had even donated to the reward fund, and Sophia had marveled at how easily he could perform normalcy while carrying such a monstrous secret. But she'd seen the cracks forming in him, subtle at first but growing wider as the weeks turned into months. Thomas had started drinking, something he'd rarely done before. He'd developed insomnia, would wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, gasping about blood on his hands. He'd become paranoid, convinced that police were watching them, that someone had seen something, that their lies were about to unravel. By September 2007, when the new school year began, Thomas had requested a transfer to a different school district. He'd told the administration at Martin Luther King High School that he needed a fresh start, a new challenge, and they'd accommodated him with a position at a school in Corona, 30 miles away. The distance felt deliberate to Sophia. Thomas removing himself from Riverside, from the scene of his crime, from the daily reminder of what he'd done. Sophia had continued teaching at Lincoln Elementary, but the joy had been hollowed out of it. She'd stand in front of her third graders, helping them sound out words and solve math problems, and she'd think about Daniel, about all the kids he would have helped if he'd lived, about the community center he'd dreamed of opening. Every time one of her students smiled at her, every time they had a breakthrough, she'd feel the weight of her guilt pressing down like a physical force. In October 2007, a woman named Patricia Monroe had approached Sophia in the parking lot after school. Patricia was the mother of one of Sophia's former students and a waitress at the diner near the community center. She'd looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from foot to foot, her eyes not quite meeting Sophia's. "Ms. Anderson, I need to tell you something," Patricia had said quietly. "About that boy who went missing, Daniel Chen." Sophia's heart had stopped. She'd forced her face into an expression of polite interest, though her hands had been shaking so badly she'd had to shove them into her pockets. "What about him?" "I was working the late shift on July 23rd, and I was taking out the trash around 8 o'clock. I saw you and him in the parking lot of the community center. And I saw your husband. I saw him approach you too, and I heard raised voices, but I had to get back inside because we were slammed. By the time I came back out, everyone was gone. I've been thinking about it ever since, wondering if I should tell the police, but I didn't want to cause trouble if it was nothing." The world had tilted on its axis. This was it, Sophia had thought. This was where it all fell apart. Patricia had seen them. She was a witness. One phone call to Detective Santos, who'd been Detective Rivera back then, less gray in her hair but just as sharp, and everything would unravel. "Patricia," Sophia had said carefully, "what you saw was my husband surprising me with a ride home. He and Daniel were just talking. Daniel walked me to my car and then Thomas showed up. That's all it was. There was no confrontation." Patricia had looked uncertain. "But I heard yelling. We had a disagreement about dinner plans. Thomas wanted to go out. I wanted to eat at home. You know how married couples bicker." Sophia had forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to her own ears. "It had nothing to do with Daniel. I'm sure he went home right after that, and whatever happened to him happened somewhere else, to someone else." Patricia had studied Sophia's face for a long moment, and Sophia had seen the exact instant when the woman decided to believe her, or at least to accept the lie. "Okay," Patricia had said slowly. I wanted to make sure. His parents seem so devastated." "We all are," Sophia had replied, and that at least had been true. Patricia had walked away, and Sophia had sat in her car for an hour, shaking so hard she couldn't turn the key in the ignition. When she'd finally driven home, she'd found Thomas already there, drinking scotch straight from the bottle, his eyes wild. "We can't do this," Sophia had said, her voice breaking. "Thomas, we have to come forward. Patricia Monroe saw us. If she talks to the police, then we deny everything," Thomas had interrupted, slamming the bottle down on the counter. "We stick to our story. We were never at the community center that night. We were home, together, all evening. That's what we told police, and that's what we'll keep telling them. It's our word against one waitress who was throwing out trash and probably didn't see anything clearly. She saw enough, but not everything. She didn't see what actually happened. She can't prove anything. As long as we hold the line, Sophia, as long as we don't crack, we're safe." But they weren't safe. Sophia had known it even then. They were prisoners of their own making, trapped in a lie that required constant vigilance, constant performance. Every knock on the door could be the police. Every phone call could be someone who knew something. Every news story about Daniel could be the one that finally connected the dots. In November 2007, Detective Rivera had called Sophia in for questioning. It had been a routine interview, she'd said, just following up on statements from people who'd been at the community center around the time of Daniel's disappearance. Sophia had gone willingly, had sat in an interrogation room not unlike the one she was in now, and had answered questions with a calm she didn't feel. "Did you know Daniel Chen well?" Rivera had asked. "We were colleagues," Sophia had replied, keeping her voice steady. "He was a volunteer counselor and I was teaching summer reading. We worked in adjacent programs." "Did you ever socialize outside of work?" "No. Our relationship was purely professional." "Did you notice anything unusual about his behavior in the days before he disappeared?" "No. He seemed happy, enthusiastic. He loved working with the kids." "Where were you on the evening of July 23rd? "Home with my husband. We had dinner together, watched some television, went to bed early." The lie had come so easily, so naturally, that Sophia had been disturbed by her own capacity for deception. She'd always thought of herself as honest, principled, someone who operated with integrity. But when survival demanded it, she'd discovered she could lie without hesitation, could look a detective in the eye and construct a false reality with perfect composure. Rivera had pressed, had asked follow-up questions, had tried to find inconsistencies in the story. But Sophia had been prepared, and Thomas had coached her, and their alibi had held. After 2 hours, Rivera had thanked her for her time and sent her home. That night, Sophia had looked at Thomas across the dinner table and realized she no longer knew who he was. The gentle man who read poetry had murdered someone in cold blood. The teacher who believed in second chances had refused to give Daniel Chen a chance at all. The husband she'd promised to love forever had asked her to become an accomplice to murder, and she'd agreed. "We're going to be okay," Thomas had said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "As long as we have each other, we'll survive this." But Sophia had pulled her hand away, unable to bear his touch. "I don't know if I can do this, Thomas. I don't know if I can live like this." His face had hardened. "You don't have a choice. We're in this together now. If I go down, you go down with me. Do you understand? You helped bury the body, Sophia. You lied to the police. You're not an innocent bystander anymore. You're an accomplice." The words had struck her like physical blows, and she'd understood then the full scope of what she'd done. In those crucial minutes after Daniel's death, when she'd chosen to help Thomas instead of calling for help, she'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She'd become someone she didn't recognize. Someone capable of watching a young man die and helping to conceal the crime. The years that followed had been a masterclass in compartmentalization. Sophia had learned to separate herself into two people. The Ms. Anderson who taught third graders with patience and kindness, who volunteered for school committees and baked cookies for parent-teacher conferences, and the Sophia Anderson who carried the weight of Daniel Chen's death in every breath she took, who saw his face in every young man she passed on the street, who heard his mother's tearful pleas in her dreams. In 2009, Grace Chin had started a foundation in Daniel's name, dedicated to supporting at-risk youth and providing college scholarships to students from immigrant families. Sophia had donated to it anonymously every year, substantial amounts that she could barely afford, as if money could somehow balance the scales of what she'd taken from the world. It was a pathetic gesture, she knew, but it was all she had. Thomas's paranoia had intensified over the years. In 2010, when a new detective had been assigned to review cold cases, Thomas had become convinced they were being investigated again. He'd installed security cameras around their house, had started tracking Sophia's movements, demanding to know where she'd been and who she'd talked to. The trust that had once been the foundation of their marriage had eroded completely, replaced by mutual suspicion and the terrible bond of shared guilt. By 2012, Sophia had seriously considered turning herself in. She drafted a confession letter, had researched what kind of sentence she might face, had even driven to the police station twice with the letter in her purse. But each time, she'd thought about Thomas, about how turning herself in would mean turning him in too, and she'd driven home instead. The bonds of their marriage, twisted and toxic as they'd become, still held her prisoner. In 2015, a true crime podcast had done an episode on Daniel's disappearance. Sophia had listened to it with a sort of masochistic compulsion, hearing Daniel's family and friends describe him, hearing theories about what might have happened. They'd speculated about human trafficking, about random violence, about Daniel running away to start a new life. None of them had come close to the truth, that he died for no reason at all, killed by a jealous, unstable man who'd convinced himself of a threat that didn't exist. The podcast had mentioned Patricia Monroe's statement about seeing Daniel with a woman and her husband in the parking lot that night, but the investigators had never been able to identify who they were, and Patricia's description had been too vague to be useful. Sophia had felt a twisted kind of relief. They'd been so close to the truth, and yet it had slipped through their fingers. Thomas had listened to the podcast too, and it had triggered something in him. He'd become obsessed with the case, with monitoring any new developments, with making sure no new evidence emerged. He'd created fake social media accounts to follow Daniel's family and friends, to watch for any signs that someone suspected them. The paranoia had consumed him, had turned him into a hollow version of himself, someone who existed only to maintain the lie. In 2017, on the 10th anniversary of Daniel's death, Grace Chen had organized a memorial service at the community center. Sophia had felt compelled to attend, though Thomas had begged her not to. She'd stood in the back of the gymnasium, watching Daniel's family and friends share memories, watching his father's hands shake as he placed flowers at a makeshift memorial, and she'd felt something inside her finally break beyond repair. After the service, William Chen had approached her. He'd been 70 then, his face deeply lined, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent a decade searching for answers that never came. "Thank you for coming," he'd said quietly. "Daniel spoke highly of you. He said you were one of the good ones, one of the teachers who really cared." Sophia had barely been able to speak around the lump in her throat. "He was special. I'm so sorry for your loss." William had nodded, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. "The not knowing is the worst part. Every day I wonder if he's out there somewhere, if he's suffering, if he needs help. My wife died not knowing what happened to our son. I don't think I'll ever forgive myself for not being able to give her that closure." The guilt had been so overwhelming that Sophia had excused herself and vomited in the bathroom, her body physically rejecting the weight of what she'd done. She'd looked at herself in the mirror, 50 years old now, gray threading through her brown hair, lines around her eyes, and she'd whispered to her reflection, "You're a monster. You're a monster who pretends to be a good person." By 2019, when Grace Chen had her fatal stroke, Sophia had attended the funeral. Thomas had forbidden it, had said it was too dangerous, too likely to draw attention. But Sophia had gone anyway, had sat in the back of the church and watched Daniel's mother be lowered into the ground, carrying her grief and unanswered questions with her into death. That night, Sophia had confronted Thomas. "We have to tell," she'd said, her voice flat and emotionless. "We have to tell William the truth. He deserves to know what happened to his son before he dies too." Thomas had looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Are you insane? We're not telling anyone anything. Grace is dead. The case has been cold for 12 years. We're safe, Sophia. We've gotten away with it." "We haven't gotten away with anything," she'd replied. "We're living in a prison we built ourselves. We haven't had a real conversation in 12 years. We don't sleep. We don't trust each other. We don't trust anyone. This isn't life, Thomas. This is just slow death." But Thomas had refused, had doubled down on the secrecy, and Sophia had realized that he would never willingly confess. His fear of consequences outweighed any moral impulse toward truth. He'd become a man who could rationalize anything, justify anything, as long as it meant avoiding punishment. In 2020, during the pandemic lockdowns, Sophia and Thomas had been forced into constant proximity, and the cracks in their facade had become chasms. They'd fought constantly bitter arguments that circled back again and again to Daniel, to the lie they'd been living, to the people they'd become. Thomas had started sleeping in the guest room, and they'd begun to live like hostile roommates rather than spouses. Sophia had thrown herself into online teaching, into finding ways to support her students through Zoom screens, desperate for any distraction from the toxicity of her home life. Her students had become her lifeline, their innocent faces reminding her that there was still goodness in the world, that not everything was tainted by what she'd done. In 2022, Daniel's sister, Emily Chen, had gotten married. Sophia had seen the photos on Facebook, Emily radiant in her wedding dress, William walking her down the aisle, an empty chair with Daniel's photo next to the family table. The caption had read, "Celebrating with everyone we love, including those who can only be here in spirit. Missing you forever, Daniel." Sophia had closed her laptop and cried for 3 hours straight, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal. Thomas had found her on the bathroom floor, curled into a ball, and he tried to comfort her, but she'd pushed him away with a violence that surprised them both. "Don't touch me," she'd hissed. "Don't ever touch me again. You did this. You took him from them. You took him from everyone who loved him. And I helped you. God help me. I helped you." Thomas had backed away, his face pale. "I was sick that night, Sophia. I wasn't myself. I had some kind of breakdown. It wasn't premeditated. It was temporary insanity." "It wasn't temporary," she'd shot back. "You've been insane for 15 years. You've been paranoid and controlling and cruel. The man I married died the same night Daniel did. You just kept walking around pretending to be him." They'd barely spoken after that night. Their house had become a tomb where two ghosts haunted separate rooms, bound together only by their shared secret and their shared guilt. Then, 3 weeks ago, everything had changed. Sophia had been grading papers at the kitchen table when her phone had rung. The caller ID had shown a number she didn't recognize, and she'd almost let it go to voicemail. But something had compelled her to answer. "Ms. Anderson? This is Detective Maria Santos from the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. I need to speak with you about Daniel Chen." Sophia's world had tilted. She'd gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "What about him?" "We found remains at a construction site in Box Springs Mountain. We believe they might be Daniel's. We're running DNA tests now, but I wanted to reach out to people who knew him, to let them know we haven't forgotten about his case." The call had lasted only a few more minutes. Santos explaining the discovery, asking if Sophia would be willing to answer some follow-up questions about Daniel's time at the community center, thanking her for her cooperation. But after Sophia had hung up, she'd sat in frozen silence for nearly an hour. They'd found him. After 18 years, they'd found Daniel's body. When Thomas had come home that evening, Sophia had been sitting in the dark living room, the locket around her neck feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "They found him," she'd said without preamble. "Construction workers at Box Springs Mountain. They're running DNA tests." The color had drained from Thomas's face. "That doesn't mean anything. Remains could be anyone. Animals could have scattered." "Stop!" Sophia had interrupted, her voice cold. "Just stop lying. Stop pretending. Stop acting like we're gonna get away with this. It's over, Thomas. It's finally over." He tried to argue, had tried to plan, had suggested running, hiding, destroying evidence that didn't even exist anymore. But Sophia had stopped listening. She'd made her decision in that moment, sitting in the dark while her husband spiraled into panic. She was going to tell the truth. Not for redemption, she knew she was beyond that. Not even for closure, though she hoped William Chen might find some measure of peace. She was going to tell the truth because she was tired. Tired of lying, tired of pretending, tired of carrying Daniel's death like a stone in her chest, tired of being someone she despised. Over the next 3 weeks, Sophia had watched Thomas fall apart. He'd called in sick to work, had stopped eating, had spent hours pacing the house like a caged animal. He'd begged Sophia to stay quiet, had threatened her, had cried in front of her for the first time in years, and through it all Sophia had felt nothing but a vast, empty numbness. Yesterday, Detective Santos had called again. The DNA results were back. The remains were definitively Daniel Chen's, and they'd found evidence, items buried with the body that contained DNA from 2 people. They were processing the results now, but Santos wanted to bring Sophia in for questioning. Sophia had agreed immediately. She'd hung up the phone, turned to Thomas, and said simply, "I'm going to tell them everything. You can come with me or you can run. But I'm done protecting you." Thomas had stared at her like she was a stranger. Maybe she was. Maybe they both were. 2 people who'd become so twisted by guilt and fear that they'd forgotten who they'd been before that terrible night in July 2007. This morning, Sophia had chosen her outfit carefully. The cream cardigan, the floral dress, the locket she'd worn for 33 years. She'd looked at herself in the mirror one last time as a free woman, had touched the locket and thought about the Thomas she'd married in 1992, the one whose photo she'd placed inside with such hope and love. Then she'd removed the photo, had taken it out of the locket for the first time in decades, and had looked at that young man's face, soft, kind, full of promise. She'd placed the photo on the dresser and had left the house without it, the locket empty against her chest. Thomas had still been in bed, sedated by sleeping pills and exhaustion, when she'd left. She hadn't said goodbye. There was nothing left to say. Detective Maria Santos studied Sophia's face across the interrogation room table, trying to reconcile the composed woman before her with the confession she'd just heard. Officer Reeves had stopped leaning against the wall and had pulled up a chair, his expression a mixture of shock and fascination. The camera in the corner continued its silent recording, documenting every word, every gesture, every moment of truth finally emerging after 18 years of darkness. "Ms. Anderson," Santos said carefully, "you understand what you're telling us? You're confessing to being an accomplice in the murder of Daniel Chen and in concealing his body." "Yes," Sophia replied simply. "I understand completely." Santos exchanged a glance with Reeves, then pulled out a legal pad and pen. "I need you to walk me through that night again, from the beginning. Every detail you can remember." For the next 3 hours, Sophia recounted the events of July 23, 2007, with a precision that came from having replayed them in her mind thousands of times. She described the community center parking lot, the way the sodium lights had cast their orange glow, the expression on Daniel's face when he'd realized something was wrong. She described Thomas's attack, the knife from their kitchen that she'd later identified as the one missing from their butcher block, the terrible minutes of watching Daniel bleed out while Thomas had held her back. She told them about Box Springs Mountain, about the exact location where they'd buried him, about the blankets they'd used and the items of Thomas's that had ended up in the grave. A watch he'd been wearing, a ring he'd lost in the hasty burial, traces of their lives contaminating Daniel's makeshift tomb. Santos took meticulous notes, occasionally stopping to ask clarification questions. "Why did your husband think Daniel was a threat to your marriage? He wasn't rational about it?" Sophia explained, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "Thomas had been struggling with depression, with feelings of inadequacy because we couldn't have children. I think he fixated on Daniel as a representation of everything he wasn't: young, optimistic, full of potential. In Thomas's mind, Daniel became a threat, even though there was never anything between us beyond professional friendship." "Did your husband ever seek treatment for his mental health issues?" "I suggested it many times. He refused. He said therapists were for weak people, that he could handle his own problems. I think he was afraid that if he talked to someone, they'd see through him, see the darkness that was growing inside him." Reeves leaned forward. "Ms. Anderson, why are you coming forward now? After 18 years, why today?" Sophia looked at him directly. "Because I'm tired of being a monster who pretends to be a good person. Because William Chen deserves to know what happened to his son before he dies without answers like his wife did. Because every day I stand in front of third graders and teach them about honesty and kindness and doing the right thing, and I'm the biggest hypocrite in the world. Because I can't do it anymore. I can't carry this another day." Her voice broke on the last words, and tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "And because Daniel deserved so much better than what we did to him. He deserved to live, to open that community center he dreamed about, to help all those kids he wanted to help. He deserved to be at his sister's wedding, to see his parents grow old, to fall in love and have his own family. And we took all of that from him for no reason except Thomas's paranoid delusions. That's not something I can keep silent about anymore." Santos pushed a box of tissues across the table, her expression softening slightly despite her professional demeanor. "Where is your husband now?" "At home. 2247 Canyon Crest Drive. He's probably still asleep. He's been taking sleeping pills, lots of them, ever since you called about finding the remains. I think part of him wants to never wake up." Santos immediately radioed for officers to be dispatched to the address. Within minutes, they received confirmation that units were en route. Sophia listened to the radio chatter with a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a movie about someone else's life rather than living through her own. "I need to ask you something," Santos said, her voice gentle now. "Over the past 18 years, did your husband ever show remorse for what he did?" Sophia considered the question carefully. In the beginning, yes. He had nightmares. He drank. He cried. But over time, the remorse transformed into something else. Self-preservation. He became more concerned with not getting caught than with what he'd done. The guilt became about potentially facing consequences rather than about taking a life. By the end, I don't think he even saw Daniel as a real person anymore, just as a secret that needed to be kept. "And you? Did you feel remorse?" "Every single day," Sophia whispered. "Every single moment. It's like carrying a weight that gets heavier with time instead of lighter. I donated to Daniel's foundation every year. I attended memorials. I volunteered at organizations for at-risk youth, trying to do the work Daniel would have done. But nothing helped. Nothing could balance what I'd done. You can't atone for helping to murder someone. You can't make that right." The radio crackled again. Officers had arrived at the Anderson residence and had taken Thomas into custody. He'd been found in the bedroom, disoriented and barely conscious from the sleeping pills. He was being transported to the hospital for evaluation before he'd be brought in for questioning. Sophia closed her eyes at the news. "Is he going to be okay?" The officers said he was responsive. "They'll make sure he gets medical attention." Santos paused. "Ms. Anderson, did your husband attempt suicide?" "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe he just wanted to sleep until all of this went away." Thomas has never been good at facing consequences. Over the next few hours, as other detectives joined the interrogation and the full scope of the investigation unfolded, Sophia provided every detail she could remember. She drew maps showing the burial location. She described the items they'd removed from Daniel's body. She gave a complete timeline of that night and the subsequent cover-up. She named Patricia Monroe as a potential witness who'd seen them at the community center. When Santos mentioned that they were already aware of Patricia's statement from 2007, that it had been in the file all along but they'd never been able to identify the couple she'd seen, Sophia felt a fresh wave of grief. They'd been on the radar from the beginning. If Patricia had been able to give a better description, if someone had connected the dots, Daniel's family might have had answers 17 years ago. Around 4 in the afternoon, Santos informed Sophia that they were formally arresting her for being an accomplice to murder and for concealing a homicide. As Santos read Sophia her Miranda rights again and placed the handcuffs around her wrists, Sophia felt a strange sense of relief. The weight she'd been carrying for 18 years hadn't disappeared, but it had changed somehow, transformed from a secret she had to hide into a truth that was finally known. They transported her to county jail for processing. As they drove through the streets of Riverside, Sophia looked out the window at the city she'd called home for over 30 years. The Mission Inn where she and Thomas had married. Lincoln Elementary where she'd taught for decades. The parks where she'd walked on weekends. All of it looked different now, as if she were seeing it for the first time, or perhaps the last. News of the arrest spread quickly. By evening, every local news station was covering the story. Beloved elementary school teacher arrested in 2007 murder of Daniel Chen. Sophia's school photo appeared on television screens across the city. Her smiling face from the Lincoln Elementary website. The face of someone trusted to teach children, now associated with homicide. The community's reaction was swift and devastating. Parents who'd loved Ms. Anderson, who'd requested her as their children's teacher, who'd praised her dedication and kindness, now flooded social media with shock and betrayal. Former students, now adults, posted confused messages about not being able to reconcile the teacher they'd loved with the woman who'd been arrested for murder. The principal of Lincoln Elementary, Margaret Chen, no relation to Daniel, released a statement expressing shock and grief. "We are devastated by this news. Sophia Anderson has been a valued member of our school community for 30 years. We never could have imagined she was capable of such a crime. Our hearts go out to the Chen family, and we are cooperating fully with law enforcement." Patricia Monroe, when contacted by reporters, confirmed that she had indeed given a statement to police in 2007 about seeing a couple with Daniel Chen on the night he disappeared. "I always wondered about that," she told Channel 7 News. "I always felt like I should have said more, done more. If only I'd gotten a better look at them. Maybe this could have been solved years ago." In his hospital room under police guard, Thomas Anderson was informed of his wife's confession. According to the officers present, he'd stared at the ceiling in silence for a full 5 minutes before finally speaking. "She told them everything?" he'd asked. "Everything," the officer confirmed. Thomas had closed his eyes. "Good. I'm so tired." When he was medically cleared, Thomas was transferred to the same county jail where Sophia was being held, though in a different section. He declined to speak to investigators without a lawyer present, unlike his wife who had voluntarily told them everything. A public defender was assigned to him, and within 24 hours, it became clear that Thomas's defense strategy would be vastly different from Sophia's admission of guilt. Thomas's lawyer, a sharp woman named Rachel Vega, issued a statement claiming that Thomas had suffered from undiagnosed mental illness at the time of Daniel's death, that it had been a tragedy born of a psychotic break rather than premeditated murder, and that Sophia had been coerced into helping him cover up the crime out of fear for her own safety. Sophia, reading the statement in her cell, felt a bitter laugh escape her lips. Even now, even when the truth was finally out, Thomas was crafting narratives, manipulating reality, trying to minimize his responsibility. But she wouldn't let him make her into a victim. She'd made her choices. She'd lived with those choices for 18 years. She would face the consequences of those choices now. The Chen family was notified of the arrests on a Tuesday morning. Detective Santos had driven to William Chen's house personally, wanting to deliver the news with compassion rather than through a phone call. She'd brought a victim's advocate with her, prepared for any reaction. William had answered the door slowly, his 78-year-old body moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones had grown brittle with age and grief. When Santos explained that they'd arrested 2 people in connection with Daniel's murder, that they finally had answers, William had simply stood there, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Who?" he'd finally asked. "Who took my son from me?" When Santos told him the names, William had been silent for a long moment. Then, Sophia Anderson. Daniel spoke highly of her. He said she was kind. His voice had broken. "Why? Why would she do this?" Santos had explained as gently as she could. Thomas's jealousy, the attack, Sophia's complicity in the cover-up. William had listened, his hands shaking, his face aging another 10 years in the span of the conversation. "All these years," he'd whispered. "She knew. She went to the memorial services. She looked me in the eye at my wife's funeral. And she knew where Daniel was the whole time." Emily Chen, Daniel's sister, had reacted with rage. She'd posted a lengthy statement on social media, her pain evident in every word. "For 18 years, we've lived with questions. We've imagined every possible scenario. We've hoped and prayed that somehow Daniel was still alive, that he'd come home. And all this time, Sophia Anderson walked free. She taught children. She was honored as Teacher of the Month. She lived her life while my brother's body decomposed in a shallow grave. While my mother died of a broken heart. While my father aged a lifetime wondering what happened to his son. There is no punishment severe enough for what she's done to our family." The post was shared thousands of times. Sophia's name became synonymous with betrayal, with the particular evil of someone who hides behind a mask of goodness while harboring monstrous secrets. But then, unexpectedly, another narrative began to emerge. 3 days after the arrests, a woman named Jennifer Torres came forward with her own story. Jennifer had been a teacher at Martin Luther King High School in 2006 and 2007, had known Thomas Anderson professionally. She gave an interview to the Riverside Press Enterprise, describing Thomas's behavior in the months before Daniel's death. "He was obsessed with his wife," Jennifer said. "He would call her multiple times during the school day. He'd show up at her school unannounced to surprise her with lunch, but it felt more like checking up on her. Some of us noticed and talked about it. It seemed controlling, possessive. But we didn't know what to do about it. You don't want to interfere in someone's marriage. Another former colleague, Marcus Williams, confirmed Jennifer's account. Thomas was paranoid about Sophia leaving him. He talked about how she was too good for him, how she deserved someone better, younger, more successful. It was like he'd convinced himself it was inevitable that she'd abandon him. I told him once that he needed to get help, see a therapist. He told me therapists were quacks and that he could handle his own problems. Clearly, he couldn't. These testimonies painted a picture of domestic psychological abuse, of a woman trapped in a controlling relationship with a man whose mental health issues had gone untreated. Some people began to view Sophia not as an equal partner in crime but as a victim herself, someone who'd been manipulated and coerced by a mentally unstable husband. Domestic violence advocates began weighing in, talking about the complex dynamics of coercive control, about how women in abusive relationships often protect their abusers out of fear or misguided loyalty. A psychologist named Dr. Lisa Chun, again, no relation to Daniel, wrote an op-ed for the Los Angeles Times exploring the psychological mechanisms that might have led Sophia to help Thomas cover up the crime. We cannot excuse her actions, Dr. Chen wrote, but we can try to understand them. A woman who has spent years in a psychologically controlling relationship, whose sense of self has been gradually eroded by her partner's paranoia and possessiveness, may find herself making choices that seem incomprehensible to outsiders. The question is not whether Sophia Anderson should face consequences. She absolutely should. But whether we can acknowledge the complexity of her situation while still holding her accountable. Public opinion remained divided. Some saw Sophia as a victim who deserved compassion and a reduced sentence. Others saw her as an adult who'd made conscious choices, who'd had 18 years to come forward and had only done so when she was about to be caught anyway. In her cell, Sophia read the news coverage with a mixture of emotions. She appreciated that people were trying to understand, that some recognized the complexity of what had happened. But she also rejected the complete victimization narrative. Yes, Thomas had been controlling. Yes, he'd been mentally unwell. But she'd still made choices. She'd still helped bury Daniel's body. She'd still lied to police, to Daniel's family, to everyone for 18 years. She didn't want to be seen as purely a victim because that would erase her agency, her responsibility. She wanted to be seen as what she truly was. Someone who'd done a terrible thing under terrible circumstances. Someone who deserved punishment but perhaps also a measure of understanding. A week after the arrests, Sophia's lawyer, a court-appointed attorney named Robert Huang, came to discuss her case. "You're not making this easy for me," he said, spreading out documents on the table between them. "You've confessed to everything. You've given police more information than they could have possibly obtained on their own. And now you're refusing to pursue any defense strategy that might minimize your role." "Because I don't want to minimize my role," Sophia replied firmly. "I did what I did. I'm prepared to accept the consequences. Even if those consequences mean spending the rest of your life in prison? Even then." Huang sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Sophia, may I call you Sophia? I understand the impulse to accept responsibility. I even admire it. But there are mitigating factors here. Thomas's controlling behavior. The fact that you weren't the one who committed the actual murder. The fact that you've lived an otherwise exemplary life. A good defense attorney could argue for a reduced sentence based on coercion, on battered woman syndrome, on the psychological pressure you were under." "I don't have battered woman syndrome," Sophia said quietly. "Thomas never hit me. He never threatened me physically. Yes, he was controlling and paranoid. But I wasn't afraid of him in that way. I helped him because I loved him, because I'd promised to love him through better or worse, and because I was too much of a coward to do the right thing. Don't let me hide behind a diagnosis that doesn't fit. You're not a coward. You're here, aren't you? You've told the truth. That takes courage. Courage 18 years too late." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Huang spoke again, more gently. "The prosecutor is interested in a plea deal. If you testify against Thomas, if you provide detailed information about his state of mind, his planning, his behavior after the murder, they're willing to recommend a sentence of 15 to 20 years instead of life without parole." Sophia closed her eyes. 15 to 20 years. She'd be 73 when she got out, if she got out. But it was less than what she deserved. Daniel would be dead forever, and she'd get a second chance at life, however limited. What happens if I don't take the deal? You go to trial. The prosecution has your confession, has physical evidence, has witnesses. You'd almost certainly be convicted. You'd be looking at 25 to life, possibly life without parole. And Thomas, with his mental health defense, might actually get a more lenient sentence than you. The injustice of that possibility struck Sophia viscerally. Thomas, who'd actually killed Daniel, might serve less time than she did because he'd be smart enough to use every legal strategy available while she insisted on accepting full responsibility. I need to think about it, she said finally. Don't think too long. The offer has an expiration date. After Huang left, Sophia lay on the narrow cot in her cell and stared at the ceiling. She could hear other inmates in nearby cells. Conversations, arguments, someone crying softly. This was her world now, at least for the foreseeable future. She traded her classroom at Lincoln Elementary for a 6x8 cell, her students' smiling faces for the harsh reality of incarceration. But even in this bleakness, Sophia felt something she hadn't felt in 18 years. A strange kind of peace. The truth was out. Daniel's family had answers. The weight she'd been carrying, while not gone, had at least been shared, distributed among the justice system, the public discourse, the court of public opinion. She thought about Daniel often in those lonely hours. She imagined what he might have accomplished if he'd lived. The young people he would have mentored. The community center he would have built. The family he might have had. All of that potential, extinguished in a parking lot because of one man's paranoia and another woman's failure to act. I'm sorry, she whispered to the empty cell, to Daniel's memory, to the universe that had been made a little darker by her choices. I'm so sorry. 6 months after the arrests, Sophia Anderson sat in a courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, watching as the judge prepared to hand down her sentence. She'd ultimately accepted the plea deal, had testified against Thomas in his trial, had described in painful detail his jealousy, his paranoia, the night he'd attacked Daniel, and the 18 years of living with the terrible secret. Thomas had been convicted of second-degree murder. The jury had rejected the first-degree murder charge, swayed by evidence of his mental health struggles, and had been sentenced to 25 years to life. He'd be eligible for parole when he was 85 years old, though parole was far from guaranteed given the nature of his crime. As she'd testified against him, Sophia had looked at Thomas across the courtroom and had felt a complicated mixture of emotions. She'd spent 33 years with this man, had loved him, had protected him, had destroyed her own soul trying to save his. And now she was helping to ensure he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. He'd stared at her throughout her testimony with eyes that were empty, hollow, devoid of the kindness she'd once seen there. When the verdict was read, he'd shown no reaction at all, had simply been led away by bailiffs without a backward glance. Now it was Sophia's turn. The courtroom was packed. William Chun sat in the front row, flanked by his daughter Emily and her husband. Former colleagues from Lincoln Elementary were scattered throughout the gallery, their faces reflecting a mixture of sadness and betrayal. Reporters filled several rows, cameras ready to capture Sophia's reaction to whatever sentence the judge would impose. Judge Karen Martinez, a stern woman in her 60s with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked down at Sophia from the bench. Ms. Anderson, before I impose sentence, is there anything you'd like to say? Sophia stood, her legs shaking slightly. She'd written a statement, had practiced it in her cell until she had it memorized. But now, standing before the Chen family, before the community she'd betrayed, before the judge who held her fate in her hands, all her prepared words seemed inadequate. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. There is nothing I can say that. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. There is nothing I can say that will undo what I've done. There are no words that can bring Daniel Chen back to his family. There is no apology that can repair the damage I've caused or heal the wounds I've inflicted. She paused, gathering her courage to continue. For 18 years, I taught children about honesty, integrity, and doing the right thing, while living the biggest lie imaginable. I stood in front of classrooms and told young people that their choices mattered, that character was defined by what we do when no one is watching, all while knowing that I had failed that test in the most fundamental way possible. Sophia's eyes found William Chen in the front row. The elderly man sat motionless, his face carved from grief and exhaustion. "Mr. Chen," she said directly, tears streaming down her face now. "I cannot ask for your forgiveness because I don't deserve it. Your son was extraordinary. He was kind, passionate, devoted to making the world better. He spoke about you and your wife with such love and respect. He told me once that everything he wanted to accomplish in life was to honor the sacrifices you made for him. He was going to do remarkable things." Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "I took that from you. I took that from the world. Not by my own hand, but by my silence, by my cowardice, by choosing to protect someone I loved more than I valued doing what was right. Every day your wife spent wondering what happened to Daniel. Every night you've gone to sleep without answers. Every milestone Daniel missed. His sister's wedding, his future children, the community center he dreamed of building. All of that is on me." William Chen's face remained impassive, but Emily was crying openly, her husband's arm around her shoulders. Sophia turned back to Judge Martinez. "I don't expect mercy. I don't want people to see me as a victim. Yes, my husband was controlling. Yes, he was mentally unwell. But I was still a grown woman capable of making my own decisions. In that parking lot, when Daniel was dying, I had a choice. I could have called 911. I could have tried to save him. I could have told the truth when police questioned me days later, or months later, or years later. I had 18 years of opportunities to do the right thing, and I failed every single time." She drew a shaky breath. "The only thing I can offer now is the complete truth, which I have given, and my commitment that for whatever time I have left, whether in prison or someday beyond these walls, I will try to honor Daniel's memory by doing the work he would have done. I've asked my lawyer to help me establish a trust that will donate everything I have. My pension, the proceeds from selling my house, everything, to the Daniel Chen Foundation. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's all I have." Sophia sat down, her body feeling suddenly depleted, as if confessing had drained whatever reserves of strength she'd been holding on to. Robert Huang patted her shoulder gently, a small gesture of support in a moment of utter desolation. Judge Martinez reviewed the documents before her, her face unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "Ms. Anderson, I have presided over many difficult cases in my 23 years on the bench, but few have affected me quite like this one. You present a profound paradox. A woman who by all accounts was an excellent teacher, a valued community member, someone who positively impacted hundreds of young lives, yet who committed one of the most selfish acts imaginable, prioritizing your own comfort and your loyalty to your husband over a young man's life and his family's right to truth." The judge's words hung in the air, heavy with judgment. "The prosecution has recommended, as part of your plea agreement, a sentence of 18 years with the possibility of parole after 15. The defense has asked me to consider your cooperation, your remorse, and your otherwise exemplary life, and to impose a sentence at the lower end of that range. The Chen family, through their victim impact statements, has asked for the maximum possible sentence." Judge Martinez leaned forward. "Ms. Anderson, you have shown genuine remorse. You have cooperated fully with authorities. You have taken responsibility for your actions in a way that is, sadly, rare in this courtroom. But your cooperation came only when you were about to be caught. For 18 years, you had the power to end the Chen family's suffering, and you chose not to exercise that power. For 18 years, you watched William and Grace Chen age under the weight of not knowing what happened to their son, and you said nothing." Sophia closed her eyes, accepting the words like physical blows. "That said," the judge continued, "I also recognize the complexity of your situation, the psychological pressure of living with a controlling, paranoid spouse, the impossible position you found yourself in after Daniel's death, the fact that you were not the person who committed the actual murder, though you became complicit in its cover-up. These are not excuses, but they are mitigating factors that I must consider." Judge Martinez picked up her gavel. "Sophia Anderson, You are hereby sentenced to 17 years in state prison for your role as an accomplice to the murder of Daniel Chen and for concealing his death. You will be eligible for parole after 14 years, at which time a parole board will determine whether you have sufficiently rehabilitated and whether your release would be appropriate. Additionally, I am ordering that all assets from your estate be liquidated and paid to the Daniel Chen Foundation, as you have requested. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the courtroom. Sophia felt her knees weaken with relief, not because the sentence was lenient, but because it was finally real, finally concrete. 17 years. She would be 70 years old when she was eligible for parole, if she was granted parole at all. But it was decided. The uncertainty was over. As the bailiffs approached to escort her out of the courtroom, Sophia caught one last glimpse of William Chen. The old man was standing now, his daughter supporting him, and he was looking directly at her. Their eyes met across the crowded courtroom, and Sophia saw in his face something she hadn't expected. Not forgiveness? Exactly. But perhaps a measure of closure. The not knowing had ended. The questions had answers. It wasn't healing. Nothing could truly heal the loss of a child, but it was something. "Thank you," William Chen said quietly, his voice barely audible over the murmur of the courtroom. "Thank you for finally telling the truth." Sophia nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat, and then she was being led away, back to the holding cell, back to the beginning of her sentence. The years that followed were a study in contrasts between the life Sophia had lived and the life she now inhabited. Prison was harsh, unforgiving. A place where her former identity as a beloved elementary school teacher meant nothing. She was simply inmate #F47293, serving time for murder. But Sophia didn't fight it. She attended every rehabilitation program available. She worked in the prison library, helping other inmates improve their literacy skills. She took college courses that the prison offered, studying psychology and criminal justice, trying to understand not just what she'd done but why, trying to make sense of the mechanisms that had allowed her to betray her own values so completely. On the outside, the Daniel Chen Foundation flourished. With the influx of money from Sophia's estate, nearly $400,000 after her house sold and her pension was liquidated, the foundation was able to expand its programs. They opened a community center in Riverside, exactly the kind of place Daniel had dreamed of creating, offering after-school programs for at-risk youth, college counseling for first-generation students, and support services for immigrant families. William Chen lived to see the center's opening. At 80 years old, frail but determined, he cut the ribbon on a sunny Saturday in October, with Emily by his side and Daniel's photo displayed prominently in the lobby. He died peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks later, having finally found the closure he'd searched for over nearly 2 decades. Emily Chen continued her brother's work, becoming the foundation's director and expanding its reach to 3 more cities in California. She never visited Sophia in prison, never responded to the letters Sophia sent every year on the anniversary of Daniel's death. But she did acknowledge, in an interview on the foundation's 10th anniversary, that Sophia's confession had given their family something invaluable. "We have our brother back," Emily said, standing in front of Daniel's grave. A proper grave now, in a cemetery near their parents, with a beautiful headstone that read, "Beloved son, brother, friend, advocate for youth. We know what happened. We know where he is. We can visit him, talk to him, remember him properly. That's a gift, even if it came far too late and at far too high a cost." Inside prison, Sophia aged rapidly. The stress of incarceration, combined with the weight of guilt she continued to carry, turned her hair completely white and carved deep lines into her face. But something else changed too, something harder to quantify. The burden of the secret, the exhausting effort of maintaining a lie, had been lifted. She was finally, for the first time in 18 years, living authentically. She was paying for her crimes. She was exactly where she belonged. Other inmates sought her out for advice, for tutoring, for someone to talk to who would listen without judgment. Sophia became known as someone who understood that people were more than the worst things they'd done, because she herself was living proof of that terrible complexity. She thought often about Thomas, locked away in another facility, but she never tried to contact him. That part of her life was over, had been over the moment she decided to tell the truth. She learned through her lawyer that Thomas had become increasingly paranoid in prison, had been transferred to a psychiatric facility after a breakdown. She felt sadness for him, for the man he could have been, for the life they could have had if he'd sought help for his mental health issues before they consumed him. But she didn't regret her testimony, didn't regret the choices that had led to both of them facing justice. 14 years into her sentence, Sophia appeared before the parole board for the first time. She was 67 years old, gray and weathered, but clear-eyed and honest in a way she'd never been during her years of freedom. "Have you been rehabilitated?" a board member asked her. Sophia considered the question carefully. "I don't know if rehabilitation is the right word for what I've experienced. I can't undo what I did. I can't become someone who didn't help cover up a murder. What I have done is learn to live with the truth of who I am, someone capable of terrible things, but also someone committed to doing better. I've spent 14 years trying to help others, trying to honor Daniel Chen's memory through service. Whether that constitutes rehabilitation, you'll have to decide." The parole board denied her application. "While we acknowledge your cooperation, your service within the institution, and your evident remorse, we feel that the severity of your crime and the extended period of deception warrant continued incarceration at this time. You may reapply in 2 years." Sophia accepted the decision without protest. 2 more years. She could do 2 more years. And she did. She continued her work in the prison library, continued her studies, continued her letters to the Chen Foundation updating them on her efforts to honor Daniel's memory. She attended therapy, participated in restorative justice programs, and slowly, painfully, learned to forgive herself not for what she'd done, that remained unforgivable, but for being human enough to have done it. When she appeared before the parole board again at 69, they granted her release. She walked out of prison on a Tuesday morning in March, carrying only a small bag of belongings and the same empty locket she'd worn the day she was arrested. Inside the locket, she'd placed a new photo, not of Thomas, but of Daniel Chen, smiling in his UCLA sweatshirt beneath the cherry blossoms. William and Grace Chen's former house, now owned by Emily, had become an extension of the foundation, housing offices and meeting spaces. Sophia wasn't welcome there, and she didn't expect to be. She found a small studio apartment, got a job at a community literacy center under a different name, and lived quietly, her past a matter of public record but her present focused entirely on service. On the 17th anniversary of Daniel's death, Sophia visited his grave for the first time. She brought flowers, cherry blossoms, though they were out of season and expensive, and she stood before his headstone for a long time, silent except for the wind moving through the cemetery trees. "I'm sorry," she finally said, as she had said so many times over the years. "I'm sorry I didn't save you. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough. I'm sorry for all the time you lost, all the life you should have lived." She placed the flowers carefully against the headstone and turned to leave. But then she stopped, turned back, and added one more thing. "But I promise you, Daniel, whatever time I have left, I'll spend it trying to do the work you would have done. I'll spend it being the person you deserved to encounter that day in the parking lot, instead of who I was. It won't bring you back. It won't make anything right. But it's all I can offer. It's all I have." The wind picked up, scattering cherry blossom petals across the grass, and Sophia Anderson walked away from the grave of the young man whose death had defined her life, carrying the weight of her choices forward into whatever future remained. Thank you for listening to today's story about Sophia Anderson and the terrible price of silence. This case reminds us that the choices we make in crisis moments can define the rest of our lives, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is finally tell the truth, even when it costs us everything.